A quarter of Jews in North America say they personally have experienced anti-Semitism in person or online. You know, that number, the graph goes right up, and it is so
scary,
overwhelming. And these are, not just in remote areas in certain parts of the country. This happens in the middle of New York City, Dallas, Los Angeles. So how to be Jewish in this moment is quite challenging, but we're also really clear. We don't want, us to cower in our houses, afraid to go out, or afraid to wear a Jewish symbol, to wear a kippah, and to go out and be proudly Jewish. We're not going to disappear, nor are we going to go into some kind of hiding. This is a country that stands on the ideals that all people, have protection, have freedom. And if some are going to threaten that, we're going to stand loudly and proudly against it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Western Spirit. Today we're in New York, so different setting than usual. Today we have a very special guest. Rabbi Rick Jacobs is a Reform rabbi and the president of the United for Reform Judaism, the URJ, the congregational arm of the Reform Jewish movement in North America, and which represents an estimated, he said, pachot o yoter, more or less, 1.5 million Reform Jews in nearly 900 synagogues across the U.S. and Canada. And so I guess, Rabbi Jacobs, if someone wants to know what's happening in U.S. Reform Judaism, and maybe even just in general in Judaism, because you are the biggest movement of Jews in America, you're the person to talk to. So it's great to have you, to speak with you in such crazy times.
Great to be with you. And yes, these are really challenging times for Jewish people wherever we live. We live in North America or Israel or any place around the globe. This has been challenging. We are, as you just said, the Union for Reform Judaism. We're the largest movement in North American Jewish life. And frankly, a lot of that growth has been since World War II.
Yes.
As Jews are trying to find a relevant, modern, but also inspiring and serious expression of Judaism, many have turned to the Reform movement.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that. I wanted to maybe get right into it before we get into October 7th and anti-Semitism, just about what does it mean to be a Reform Jew. We were talking about, before we started recording, the fact that I grew up here in Brooklyn, New York as a Lubavitch Chassid. Now I don't have the whole uniform, but yeah. And so then I moved to Israel at the age of 14. I was sent to yeshiva. And in Israel, I came from a place here, Lubavitch, we didn't know anything about Reform Jews here. I think it's a little bit sad, but we'll talk about that maybe in the side note. Then you go to Israel, and I've become very not Lubavitch, but still Shomer Shabbat, and I guess modern Orthodox, if you want to say it in American terms. But still, I don't know anything about Reform Jews. And I think it's a very sad state of affairs, and you've been speaking about it for years, the fact that maybe you can just get into, first of all, what it means to be a Reform Jew. But I think more importantly, why do you think in Israel, Reform Jew, people like me don't know anything about Reform Jews?
So first, let me say a sentence about Reform Judaism. It's a response to modernity. The idea that the Jewish tradition has always updated and made changes. So some of the very significant changes we made in the Reform movement, which were 150 years old here in North America, to make sure that Judaism spoke to the current generation. Women were ordained in the Reform movement. First woman ordained in North America
as a rabbi.
As a rabbi is 1972, Rabbi Sally Pruzan. And it opens the gates of this Judaism is for everybody. We also have changed our liturgy and made sure that we are true to kind of the essence of tradition, but not be held in one place. Mm-hmm. So I would say that, our movement is comprised of people who observe holidays. Prayer is meaningful. Learning is central. And social activism is also another expression of Jewish commitment, how we shape a more just, a more peaceful, and frankly, a more hopeful world.
Now to Israel, about what you think.
Well, first of all, I think, in Israel, I'll just belabor the obvious for 1 second. The ultra-Orthodox really dominate the religious space. Yes. So it's like swimming against the tide. However, I will just tell you the Reform movement and the conservative movement are growing in Israel.
Yes.
And what we love is in the school system, for Israeli kids to be educated, there's more than one way to be Jewish. And there are many authentic ways to be Jewish. So I think it is changing, but we are always up against the chief rabbinate, the ultra-Orthodox parties that dominate what can be done. I, as a Reform rabbi, cannot officiate at a wedding. And I have to also be very insistent in the case of a funeral in Israel to have a proper role. So again, we're there because I think Israelis want a Judaism that's relevant and it's not only the most traditional. Most traditional is authentic. We're not against any form of Judaism. We just think we have the Judaism that really resonates for people.
Yeah. And also, let me just say a few things about, just to get your, before we get into current events, just in general, we've had, before October 7th, we had the whole thing about the Kotel, about there was supposed to be maybe the right word to be an area of the Kotel that would be more inclusive in terms of women and men and the different denominations that could pray there. And it was accepted by the government. And then because of pressure, I think because of the media, the ultra-Orthodox media pressuring their representatives, and in turn, they pressuring the government basically like caved in and just basically, so now when someone who's a Reform Jew wants to go to pray at the Kotel, he doesn't really have the option of doing it the way he would want to pray in his synagogue. And those are things that I assume as your congregants come to you and they're like, what is going on?
Well, first of all, I was part of the small group that actually led that with Natan Sharansky and Avichai Mendelblit, who was then the cabinet secretary, and the prime minister was very much in favor. And as you say, it was passed by the government. And our goal was not to displace ultra-Orthodox Jews or traditional Jews who would like to pray in the manner that Orthodox Jews pray, which is separating men and women. We don't pray that way. Right. So the idea was there would be a separate space. It's called the egalitarian section. It's near Robinson's Arch. It's actually still the Kotel, but it's also separated. So it's not right there in a kind of assertive way. And we thought this is a good solution. One wall for one people. Why not have a place for all of us? But that was unacceptable to, I think, the Haredi establishment. But we're not giving up because it is the right solution for the Jewish people.
And it all depends, which is very sad, that it all depends on the political constellation of the fact that I think one thing that you did say that I do agree with, again, we come from different backgrounds, but one thing that I could say that I agree with is that competition is good. And when you have a monopoly on religion in Israel and there's no alternative, you become, in Hebrew they say me'uvan, you come like a stone, you come something that's not willing to not change on your principle, but change on the way you treat people. For example, one of the big things that Israelis complain about all the time is how the rabbinate treats them when they get married, when they get divorced, or when they need to die, and stuff like that. So, and one of the main reasons is that there's no alternative. So there's no reason when you have a monopoly, there's no reason for it to change. So I think that even Israelis that maybe they're not Reform Jews or there is a reason just for that, to allow other people to come in with different ideas, you don't have to accept it, but let them challenge the status quo in a sense.
For sure. And let's just say here, there's no actual religious establishment. Right. So what that means is we're all on the same playing field. Nobody gets a special allowance from the government, which means that all of our Jewish communities are in the same game of making meaning and making, kind of a positive, important, inspiring impact on people. And frankly, that's also part of why we get along. And there is more respect among the different groups. I can meet with the head of Chabad in a very respectful and honest way. Local congregations are doing study in Elul with the Orthodox synagogue around the corner. That's typical here.
That could not be in Israel.
It's atypical and is practically not found at all in Israel. And that's a shame.
Yes. I can't even believe what you just said. It's like, so it's beyond, in Israel, they would kill the Orthodox rabbi who would agree to, I remember, I think it was with you or some congregation that came to Israel and someone met with you and they went crazy. Was that with you? There was a reform. I remember it was very distinctly, there was a reform. I think it was Bennett. He gave a speech at a reform event, and you probably know. And then he came back, and he was attacked like.
Right. I'll give you the story because I was with Bennett the day he had that experience. He went to a non-Orthodox day school. He's, to bring a message of we're one people.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful message. And the idea that he would walk into a Jewish day school, educating Jewish children to be committed Jews and to love Israel, and that was somehow asur, was just unimaginable.
They went crazy.
And we had lunch at a group of rabbis that day, and he already kind of had an inkling that he would get pushback, but good for him that he did it anyway.
Okay, so that's basically the story about Israel, Reform Jews, where we are, the challenges. Now I want to get to like the current events. So October 7th happens. We were in, I was there, and it was horrible. I know personally a few people that passed away on the day, and then since on reserves. How were Jews in America? You represent over, we said, about 1,500,000 Jews, probably more. People who come, sporadically, it's probably way more to synagogue. Just in general, how is the mood? Because we know that it was a sort of an inflection point for Jews all over the world. Could you just give us a little bit of a flavor? What did Jews feel here and since?
This was a devastating blow to all Jewish people. And here we were, it was Simchat Torah, it was Shabbat. I don't, use a lot of technology, but because we have kids all around the world and programs, I have to always have my phone with me.
Yeah.
And, I just happened to glance at it, before heading out to shul, and it was just exploding with, people, WhatsApp from people. Did you hear? Did you do? You have to know. And I had very close friends along the Gaza border in Kfar Aza, Nachal Oz. And so immediately we got a sense that something was going on. We didn't have the scale, but already people, in synagogue that morning to convey that something catastrophic is underway. And I would say in the first weeks, our community was simply awakened to this reality, kicking into gear to lobby the U.S. government, to lobby on behalf of our Jewish
donations
community.
A lot.
Donations. We joined together as one Jewish community to raise funds. And, right away, there was that sense. I got on a plane, 2 weeks after, and frankly, there weren't a lot of people other than soldiers returning home for their units. But it felt very important to be there and at that point, I was going from Shiva to Shiva, as all Israelis were doing, because it has affected all of our, relationships. And what was clear is that this wasn't simply, another one of the attacks from, Hamas in Gaza with rockets, horrible as those were. This was at a whole different scale, something we had not seen since the Shoah. So I would say throughout the Reform movement, and frankly, all of organized Jewish life, there was a shudder of pain and loss. And then quickly moving to, we have to also stand up for Israel as, the ground war started. And we knew that it would be days before the world would push back. Yeah. We just had that clear sense. So we had a role to play, not the same in any way of the idea of soldiers on the ground, but we had to be standing up in our communities, on the media, and in the halls of power to make sure that Israel had the support it needed.
So about that, I think it was the day after October 7th in Times Square, right, pretty close to where we are right now. There's right away, before Israel pretty much did anything in response, because in the first few days, first of all, the army was, it's not our area of expertise, but the army basically collapsed in the area. There was no offensive. Right. They were just trying to get the terrorists out of all the kibbutzim and the areas. It took about a week to clear Israel out of terrorists. So there was obviously no offensive game. It needed to be planned. It turns out the plans weren't there. It was so it took time. Yeah. And right away, in Times Square, there was a protest the day after, I'm pretty sure, of people who were I think pro-Hamas in a way, because you had Hamas flags, you had anti-Israel slogans, from the river to the sea, the things we've been seeing for the past, before October 7th, but probably much more. I think maybe you can just, as a spiritual matter, I know, and then I'll ask you practicality. It seems to me that a lot of the fervor of the protests here were because people felt that they had a chance at gaining their end goal of destroying Israel. So when people think that they might be able to do it, they saw October 7th, they were in sort of an ecstasy of, do you think that might be it? That there is some sort of...
Well, here's what I would say. On October 8th, this was not solidarity with Palestinians.
Exactly.
It was not, we need a two-state solution. It was not, we need dignity and tranquility for Palestinians. It was pro-Hamas. And that was just stunning, I think, to any normal person.
The amount of people also.
Well, they weren't that large, but they weren't in any way masking, literally and figuratively, what they were there to say. They were celebrating. They were celebrating the attack on October 7th. And frankly, I don't think we have human, capacity to understand how is it that you celebrate such a brutal attack of terrorism, sexual violence. We saw, the GoPro cameras and it was already circulating. How is it that people celebrate that?
That's
I'm not going to explain it because I don't, it's not my world, but I would say, and we could talk about this, the college campuses were more varied.
And it took time also for them to start. It took time.
And there were people who were protesting war.
Yeah.
I grew up after, the 67 and 73 war. There was a war in Vietnam. Being anti-war is not a immoral stance. However, to not understand that Israel didn't choose this war chose Israel. And Israel had to both defend Israel, and it also had to prevent that there would be future October 7th. So when people would celebrate Hamas, we'd say, you're not supporting Palestinians, you're celebrating terrorism. So later on, there were more of the anti-war. We want this war to stop. The cost of the war has been enormous on Israel, and yes, on innocent Palestinian citizens, which we hear from Rachel Goldberg Poland, probably the most eloquent person, in speaking up on behalf
Hirsch's mother,
the Zichrono Livracha. And she would, anytime she would speak, and she spoke, often, and with, President Biden and all our big rabbis, she'd always say, let us stand up for the hostages, not just my son Hirsch, and all of the innocents in Gaza. And some people at first were saying, excuse me, is that really the sermon you want to give? She was absolutely clear, including her husband, John, at the Democratic National Convention just a few weeks ago. He said, there's no competition in suffering. Suffering is suffering. So the cost of this war has been enormous. But the idea that, you might have some empathy for the innocents in Gaza does not mean you don't fully support Israel's need to defend herself, and that the attack not only on October 7th, but frankly, the brutality of these hostages experience.
What we just saw with the 6 hostages being just
overwhelming.
Executed, executed.
Yes.
And I have to say, just because they're Jewish, at the end of the day, they were taken hostage because they're Israeli and they're Jewish. We know there were Muslim hostages. They were taken because they're Israeli and they support the Jewish state. So There are brothers. It's a horrible situation. It's the evilness that we're dealing with a lot of the Hamas people is something that a lot of people can't comprehend, in a sense, because like you said, people living in America or in the West in general, they generally speak to each other in a way we feel that the people that we're dealing with are good.
Yes.
We're okay. We might disagree. But generally speaking, people are good to each other. We say thank you, we say sorry. We're not thinking in terms of what we saw on October 7th. So how did you, this is another question, how did you explain to your congregation, to the people who listen to your sermons, just the different levels of depravity that we saw? We're so not used to it on a human level.
Yeah, we've been telling the narrative of what happened, and including a few months ago, Sheryl Sandberg, formerly of Facebook, made a powerful film to say, friends, I don't know where you are in the spectrum of political commitments, but what happened on October 7th, the sexual violence was itself, such a violation. And where is the world that could speak up on behalf, as it should, when there's an attack in Africa or somewhere else? So what we were clear about is, first of all, many of us had relationships with people, Nachal Oz, I've been there many times. I've been there, with Amir Tibon and his family, Kfar Aza with Ofer Lepstein, who, literally one of the first people to die on October 7th, because he was the, one of the people responsible to get the weapons.
Right.
There was an attack.
Kitat Konenut, it's called.
Yes. And his son, we hoped, was a hostage. Can you imagine? We were hoping he was a hostage. And of course, turned out he also was murdered. So to walk into, that Shiva, the two. So, we had relationships. We also know that many of the people along the Gaza border were among the most peace, seeking that we have. Vivian Silver in Kibbutz Be'eri. This is a woman whose whole life was about building bridges.
With Gaza.
With Gaza, driving Gazans to hospital to get special treatments. So I think, it would have been horrific no matter where it was. But I think there was already a deep sense of commonality with some of the people who suffered the most.
Yeah.
And, I have to say in every one of our congregations, I've been to a whole lot of them, this past year, not one, was somehow missing the daily and weekly call to action around the hostages. What can we do? What must we do? And so I think it became very personal. And for some people, I'll just be honest, Israel was far away. And maybe they had gone on a trip. Maybe their, child had gone on birthright. But this now became personal. And we saw, kind of a rising up of commitment and connection, which was really powerful, as well as a few who were on the far, far left of progressive sensibilities who, joined some of the protests for ceasefire now. And, my feeling as the leader of the Reform movement, some of those kids grew up in our movement. Many did not. My goal was to stay in relationship with them, not to say you're right, not to say, what you're saying and demanding is what the movement demands, but I wanted them to be able to experience some of the other dimensions of this horrific attack, and to make sure that they also carried responsibility for the hostages and for frankly, the vulnerability of Israel with Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis in Yemen and Iran. Do people think this is Israel's in some idyllic place? So again, the worry is still enormous. And as we approach a new year, I have to say a lot of us are really feeling trepidation. There's still so much that's not, better. And, the possibility that we will know more really, really, deep loss is possible. And the 101 hostages, how many are still alive, the ages, they are part of our family. So I do think that there will be a lot of sermons given in a couple of weeks, powerful sermons, sermons not just about something that happened, but something that happened to us.
And that's still happening now.
100%.
I want to ask you something that's a little bit that I've been hearing from friends of mine who I assume would be more I'm not sure if they're all Reform Jews, but more inclined to reform than where I grew up. And let's just say it like that. Progressive Jews in America felt, especially young ones, college students, you mentioned the protests we had in colleges and universities, they felt that once October 7th happened and all these protests were happening, that they're natural allies. So Jews would go to the Black Lives Matter protest. They would go to donate and volunteer for different minority communities, LGBTQ, all these different causes that, tikkun olam, for all the different causes for the progressive Jewish movement or progressive Jews, maybe not just in the movement. And then October 7th happens, and a lot of Jews felt that their allies betrayed them. They stuck a metaphoric knife in their back. So they were in deep, we just said a day after, not all the protests were the day after, but my point is that they felt that there wasn't the sympathy and the protesting for them that they would do for the others. So how do you even explain this sort of, is it anti-Semitism or is it just the sort of feeling that the Jews are so successful, they don't need us? Where do you see this?
Well, first, I'm going to make a little bit of a differentiation because in my world, I didn't lose all those deep relationships with people who lead Christian communities, Muslim communities, people who are part of the very progressive causes that we're very involved in. There were some, I'll be very candid, there were some who, frankly, not only disappointed, but broke off. Others, I received so many messages and outpouring from people we work closely with, some of whom said on a personal level, in a WhatsApp, in a call, in a text, I feel your pain, my condolences on the losses. And my response in many of those cases was, what about saying that a little bit more publicly? How about a sermon? I would love, can we read that in a newspaper? And I would say, there were some who actually did speak up, wrote pieces, circulated, sign on of support for the Jewish community. So I don't want to say categorically everyone, ghosted us, but there were some who did. And the goal was to, stay connected, see if some of those people could be brought back. And I've spoken at progressive gatherings. People didn't all agree with me. I'll be really candid about that as well. But it's really important that they know who we are and that we're not walking away from the things we're committed to. We're committed to them because it's deeply a part of our Jewish set of commitments. But the people who, said outrageous things, that weren't just, kind of protesting Israeli actions. They were protesting our very existence. And those are not bonds that will probably ever be healed. But that's not, the entirety of our network. And I'll just say also, if Jews are not going to be part of, coalitions of people standing up for whether it's women's rights, civil rights, you name it, Black Lives Matter, or at least, the idea that somehow every person has, this
intrinsic
divine,
worth.
From our tradition, the divine image. That we're not going to be able to create enough security with cameras and with, security guards. Our security is in our solidarity. We also do the cameras and the security guards. But part of what we have to do, and what has been uniquely American, is that we have been accepted and supported here. And that is something we can't allow to wither.
Yeah. Well, I agree. For sure, we're not talking about everyone, but I did think, like, for example, and this has nothing to do with specifically Reform Jews, but just as an American Jew, when you hear, for example, people saying, it sounds crazy, but but you hear it. It's like you said outrageous things, but they've become mainstream and it's very sad. For example, I remember like maybe a month after October 7th, Judith Butler, and I'm pretty sure she's also Jewish. She's a feminist, radical feminist icon. She said, Hezbollah and Hamas, they're part of the feminist movement. And you have all these things, the Canadian professors that said that the rapes were justified for feminist studies in Canada, different things that are so out of the, you heard, if you would hear it a year ago, you would be, these are crackpots, but it's become mainstream all over. And we hear, and we've been seeing things on the right lately that are very, very scary. If you go on Twitter, you'll see things just out in the open, like anti-Semitism, like in the Middle Ages. But that I think is like obvious. So you see it's in your face. Right. Everybody could see it. The problem is that a lot of these professors, they say it in a way that's it's almost like it's academic, So like, how do we combat it? Just as not even as a Reform Jew, all Jews should be scared of this.
Yeah, no, what you're saying is absolutely true. One is to not let them be uncontested. You say that, it has to be challenged because it's outrageous. It is also really important that we find the ways to, uncover the smaller ones. When people say from the river to the sea, that's the classic. People say, which river? Do you know which river? Do you know what sea we're talking about?
Most of them don't know.
But when they, and some will give an explanation that might be plausible, but when they say, we don't want, no 2 states, we want 48. Mm-hmm. I say, okay, try to take that apart and give me a positive. That's basically a world without a state of Israel. So it's not hidden at all. It's right there in plain sight. So I think we have to really, kind of be vigilant, and including being in the media. I'm regularly, and my colleagues, we're regularly on media, writing, speaking, making sure that the case being made is one that also is made from the liberal progressive community. We may be liberal and progressive, but we don't condone, and we don't in any way stand in some way and say, well, that's just the way it is. It is not the way it is. And, I think that, some of the things that are said are outrageous. Some of them are quietly repeating old anti-Semitic tropes that go way back in
Middle
medieval,
Ages even.
And even going back to, Christianity and some of the idea of religious anti-Semitism. So it's awakened a whole new kind of cadre of anti-Semitism, which is real. A quarter of Jews in North America say they personally have experienced anti-Semitism in person or online.
And most hate crimes in America are done against Jews, and they're like very much smaller.
Religious hate crimes.
Religious hate crimes, sorry.
There are other kinds of hate crimes.
Obviously.
It's really important to distinguish. But that, that number, the graph goes right up, and it is so
scary,
overwhelming. And these are, not just in remote areas in certain parts of the country. This happens in the middle of New York City, Dallas, Los Angeles. It does happen to our students. They're in middle school and they hear these things, sometimes from a teacher, sometimes from another student. So how to be Jewish in this moment is quite challenging, but we're also really clear. We don't want, us to cower in our houses, afraid to go out or afraid to wear a Jewish symbol, to wear a kippah, and to go out and be proudly Jewish. We do have to be smart, and some people, feel like they live in very dangerous areas. So, I understand that, but we're not going to disappear, nor are we going to go into some kind of hiding. This is a country that stands on the ideals that all people, have protection, have freedom. And if some are going to threaten that, we're going to stand loudly and proudly against it.
Are you, should a Jewish person in the U.S., like when I came, I wore a yarmulke. When I asked my father, this was the first time I was born in New York City. I grew up with the hat, the jacket, the beard, the whole thing. You couldn't not think, maybe Amish, right. But other than that, you couldn't think that I wasn't a Jewish person.
Right.
But I still wear a yarmulke. And before I came, I said to my father, should I wear the yarmulke when I walk around in New York City? Because you've been hearing all this stuff, and I have friends that studied at Columbia and they did get harassed. And he said, listen, it's a decision you have to make. I'm not going to like this, but it is something to think about. I never would have thought to tell you to think about it. And do you think that the government, the federal government, Israel, is there a role to be played by, or is it just by the authorities, or is it just a societal thing where we have to just work and explain and, like you just said, go out and combat it? And where is the balance here?
There needs and there is a governmental response. This is not on us individually. If we're being harassed and attacked, and anti-Semitism is real to literally a quarter of the Jews in America, this is not something we just hope will get better.
Yeah.
So the United States government, led by President Biden, has a full all of government response to anti-Semitism, which is the most serious response we've seen. And we've been meeting regularly with the Attorney General and the head of the FBI and the Secretary of Education and the Secretary of Homeland Security, because they are on the job to protect. Now, of course, what happens in the university is very important, that students are protected.
Yeah.
Yes, freedom of speech, but if I can't walk across the campus to go to my class, something is wrong. And it's not just college. We are hearing as well from high school students, junior high school. So, where is government? And the answer is, in many of our communities, they are absolutely prioritizing our safety. Here in New York City, you go to almost any synagogue on a Shabbat.
There's police
there, and police that actually knows their way around counterterrorism. So I would say that there has been a very significant response.
So you're happy with the way the authorities are? I mean, obviously it can't be perfect. You always have. But we just saw, like in Canada, there was a guy that was caught that he was planning on coming to New York, where we are right now. And supposedly he says, I guess in an investigation, that he wanted to bomb or shoot up a synagogue in New York City. So it's a very dangerous time.
It's a very dangerous time. I would have to say the government has been quite effective, local government, state and federal. And in Canada, I just met with the leadership of the Canadian Reform movement and the head of the UJA Federation. We're all working together. This is the Jewish community as it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Working together with a very real threat to our very well-being.
And working across denominations, which isn't happening in Israel.
Right. By the way, we do that pretty regularly.
Yeah.
We sit at the table at these meetings with all these government leaders. You have the head of the Orthodox Union. You have the head of the conservative movement. I'm there. And the ADL, American Jewish Committee, and Jewish Federation of North America. We are on the same team. And I also know from my Orthodox colleagues here in New York, particularly my Haredi colleagues, that very often, as you described, you step out of your house, you are identifiable in entirety.
You have more outside.
I could put a baseball cap on. People think I'm a Yankees fan or a Mets fan. A Haredi Jew can't literally disguise. So we have to be particularly vigilant about speaking up when it happens, as it does here in New York City. But this is an all of Jewish people. And I'd say in America, it's an all of government response.
Yes. And when we look at Europe, I was just going to say that it's way worse. So like I have friends in London and they on Saturdays, on Shabbos, cannot go out of their vicinity because they have these giant protests, and the protests there are way less nuanced than they have here. The protests there are mamash. You have Hamas flags and Hezbollah flags and even the Houthi flags.
Right.
I don't even understand why anyone would wear whatever. So it's very, very different there than here. Here you still have cooperation between like you said, the government, the authority. So there is a sort of, everybody wants to get to a certain place where it's safer for people to live their lives. I want to ask you something that just to like, we're talking about America, we're talking about October 7th, but one thing that I do think that is interesting to ask you about is what we're seeing now on the streets in Israel. So we're seeing, obviously, before October 7th, the whole judicial reform, and it was a lot of the arguments about judicial reform were also brought into American Jews because you had people saying, let's talk with these lawyers in America, they'll give their thing, and the people that were pro were giving their lawyers. Everybody has their American friends, like, the Jewish doctors, they had the American lawyer. But also it seems to me, and I said it at the time, that the protests we're seeing now, before, it's deeper. There's a very big discontent and social, no one's happy. No one's content with the way things are. And even if there wasn't the judicial reform, there would be a different reason that people would be depressed about and feeling that their country isn't going in the right direction. And first of all, if you want to comment on that, but I think the main question I would ask you is, how does an American Jew, in this case, a Reform Jew, look at what's happening in Israel, and how do people who really care about Israel and care about Jews in general, but how do you see, like, is it depressing as much as being there? Or how do you think
there are a lot of pieces to the puzzle.
Yeah.
Let me start by saying, before October 7th, go back to February of 2023.
Yeah.
I was the first non-Israeli to speak at Kaplan on a Motzei Shabbat. And it was kind of amazing, 150,000 people. And I wanted to bring a voice of love for Israel and strong support of the rule of law, the Supreme Court, the things that actually make democracy possible, but also to do it out of Jewish commitment. I think, the year before October 7th was a very troubling year for many of us. And the current Israeli government has been one that really is hard for those of us who love Israel but are liberal Jews. Mm-hmm. It's hard for us because it's.
Could you maybe get into?
I'll get very, very specific.
Yeah.
When Bezalel Smotrich was nominated to be the finance minister, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the minister of public security, I said, kind of very loudly in the media, that would be like appointing David Duke to be the Attorney General of the United States. David Duke was one of the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan. And people said, oh, that's a terrible analogy. And I said, it may be terrible, but I believe it's accurate. So for those of us who are liberal, we love Israel before October 7th. We love it intensely afterwards. That doesn't mean we have to agree with the Israeli government. It doesn't mean that we have to say that, the violence of certain settlers against Palestinians is acceptable, and that those who, frankly, are using this moment to try to change the status quo on the Temple Mount, that these are things that literally could lead to World War III. So for us, we want to make it clear to particularly our young people, you can differ from a government. By the way, we have some political differences here in America. I don't know if you've caught that, but you can love America and not agree with the president or the former president. And that is not only acceptable, but it's understood. That's still true when it comes to Israel. So for a lot of the people who would show up, 300,000 of us showed up in Washington on November 14th to act in solidarity for Israel, and with all kinds of political leaders who were there. It didn't mean that we, were supporting every policy of this government. It didn't mean we were supporting the judicial coup. It meant that Israel is fundamental to all Jewish life. It's the greatest miracle of modern, Jewish history. And we stand with Israel even when we stand against policies of the government. That, for some people, feels like, well, you can't do that in a time of war. And I would argue you must do that so people understand. When I say that I'm a Zionist, which I am proudly, people say, well, that means you agree with everything that's going on in Israel. I said, why would it mean that?
Even most Israelis don't agree.
Most Israelis. And that's when your point, Ariel, about what's happening today. The protests are so varied, right? They're protesting the hostages. Why isn't the government prioritizing the hostages' return number one? They're protesting as well, frankly, this government and the calls for election. Yeah. They're protesting, frankly, the whole notion of what does victory look like and what's going to happen afterwards. So there's so many things. And frankly, we still protest here. But during the judicial coup, there were regular protests in many cities.
Here in America?
Here in America. And not just Israelis. Many of us, I spoke at a few of those protests, and they were protests with Israeli flags and Hebrew and pride. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different thing. So I think that, of course, is the backdrop. And then October 7th shakes all of that to the core.
But I guess let me just say two things, and then I'll ask one thing, and then I'll ask you a question. Just to add about the settler violence, I think that one of the things that I've never understood, and I lived in Gush Etzion and in Ariel. My bachelor's degree is from the university in Ariel, which is in the West Bank, and I've lived in a few places in the West Bank over the years, and I've never understood why the politicians, or a lot of the politicians of the right, seem to think that if they condemn violence of the Nor Agvaot, what they're called, the settler extremists who burn Palestinian, vehicles, homes, pelt, rocks on Palestinian cars,
uproot their trees,
the trees, whatever, everything that we see. Why, if you condemn that, does that mean that you're doing something wrong to the Hityashvut, to the settlements? It's the opposite. When you show that you have an understanding for people who do violent things, you're totally uprooting the legitimacy, whatever legitimacy you still have in the world, and even with the Jews in outside and inside of Israel. So I think in that instance, in that case, I agree with you 100%. It's baffling, because, and even if there's one or two crazies in the government, in the Knesset, okay, but how is it that it isn't getting more condemnation, just as a practical level?
Condemnation and prosecution.
Yes, obviously, that's the next point of you. First, you say it's not right, and now how do we take care of it? So I think first you need to identify the problem, then take care of the problem. I guess my question was, when the protest and you look at the rift inside Israeli society, so you have 50%, just broadly, roughly speaking, of the people feel that their country is being taken away from them. They feel that there's such quick change, and for the worse, in the past 4 or 5 years, especially since the judicial issue came up. But even before, there was and 50% love or roughly again, when we look at the polls, for example, it's basically 50-50. How, maybe even historically as a Jewish scholar, how do you, the fact that the entire Jewish community, the biggest Jewish community in the world, in Israel right now, most Jews, I think, live in Israel. It's the biggest community. 50% are here, 50% are there. They can't, it almost is impossible to talk to each other. They're talking past each other. There's almost, at least when you speak about politics, there's hatred of each side, hates each other to the bone almost. How do we get out of this? How do we, I'm asking just because I don't know. It's almost give up.
Yeah, well, when you talk about polarization, we're doing a pretty good job here in America, and sometimes Israel actually is one of those polarizing issues in American politics. But I think, listen, in Israel, the idea that we have a Jewish democratic state, and there are plenty of people who would, trade the democratic, and say that's not essential. The Jewish is what's essential. And there's the reverse of that. And those who say it only if it's democratic, the Jewish we could lose. Like for me, and I think for the majority of American Jews, it's the Jewish democratic state. Those two belong.
I think for Israelis too.
They belong together. It's also part of our protection. It's also part of our value system. 1/5 of Israelis are not Jewish. They deserve full rights. They're not just there to, to live on the margins. So again, how do we create a society which Zionism was, committed to building and has built the most remarkable state, I have to say. All said and done, we have the challenges of the last year and the last couple of years, but it's still an extraordinary achievement for the Jewish people. Yeah. And it should be an exemplar of Jewish values. And sometimes when I hear, ultra-Orthodox politicians speak, I wonder what tradition they're speaking from. I wonder what Torah they're reading. And it concerns me greatly. And one of the things that we hear regularly from our almost 2,000 Reform rabbis here in America, they say, I want to hear more authentic Torah. My colleague, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, member of Knesset, he was just here this past Shabbat. And we were together on Friday night at Central Synagogue in Manhattan. And, here he is every day raising a Jewish voice. And he's talking about the chatufim, the hostages, and say, let's look at the sources. What does the halakha say about our obligations in bringing back? It's actually not something that's the possession of the ultra-Orthodox. It's all of our tradition. So again, I think we're trying to see how do we ground our society that respects diversity of Jews, diversity of humans, and does it in a way that, frankly, lifts up our core teachings. That's what we're trying to do here, and that's part of the political discourse. But it's a big challenge, and I think one of the things that we could model for Israelis, you take away political power, the chesed that is expressed on behalf of Jews. My community that I was part of for 20 years as the rabbi with the local Orthodox synagogue.
Is that in Brooklyn Heights?
No, this is in Westchester, New York. My Chavruta, Rabbi Jake Rubenstein, of blessed memory, we decided, on the high holidays, we couldn't bring our communities together to pray. We studied regularly, but for tashlich, we could do that together. Yeah. And what a beautiful expression for our communities, not just standing, looking at each other like, who are you, but knowing one another and doing the ritual together. Such an uplifting, beautiful thing. Now, in Israel, that would
Never
risk
happened.
the lives. But I'm saying that the idea of some of that more harmony of respect, we're actually living out here. And again, not that everything's better here. It's not. We have real challenges. But on Ahavat Yisrael, I do think that our communities are practicing it in a beautiful and authentic way. And that would be something we could share with our colleagues.
And that we need to take the state out of the religion. And I think that would be, in most cases,
would be better for
much
everyone.
Better. Even for the Haredim, I think. Last question, because we could go on for hours, but I just want to ask you one last question. One of the things, and it's not political per Netanyahu, but it is something that's being talked about, is that one of the big criticism of Netanyahu himself is that he made, and you mentioned this before in a different context, the Israel issue, he made it a polarizing thing in America. So, for example, it used to be that Israel was nonpartisan. It used to be Republicans, Democrats come together about one thing, it would be Israel, the importance of helping Israel, supporting Israel. Israel is our greatest ally, etc. And the criticism is that Netanyahu himself, the way he handles it, the way he talks to people. I interviewed Brett Stevens not too long ago. It's his big critique about Netanyahu. The main critique is that Netanyahu pushed away the Democrat Party from him and made the Republicans his main issue. And so first of all, do you think that's true? And second of all, what do we do to fix that? Why is it? And what do we do to fix that? Final thing.
I absolutely agree that Prime Minister Netanyahu is the one most responsible for, I would say, the elimination of the bipartisan support. It is the thing that has kept Israel safest. And the support was in the Congress, in the House, in the Senate, and the White House. No matter who was there, Democrat or Republican, Israel was a common commitment. And, frankly, the Prime Minister really took aim at the Democrats. And now, of course, it's part of American politics. And so you hear the former president campaigning, and he demonizes anyone who disagrees with,
who votes
Netanyahu,
Democrat,
or in any way has a different expression. And that is carried into the Congress. However, I would say when it comes to major votes, like the votes for military aid, it is still bipartisan, but it is so weakened because of that kind of political behavior. There are consequences to actions. And I would say to, Americans, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhists, Israel is our ally. It's not a favor to the Jewish community. It's in our interests. And, to have a country that's surrounded in a sea of hostility, that is a beacon of, the democratic values is powerful. So I think one of the things that we're going to be paying for a long time is that, the elimination of the bipartisan support. And, I hear it, in terms of the debate that just happened last week with the two candidates for president. Israel should be the thing that they say is off the table. No matter who's going to be in that White House, Israel is our ally, our responsibility. And I think that's one of the things that we try to recoup. And, I know when Yair Lapid was prime minister and when Naftali Bennett was prime minister, they came and regularly spent time with Democrats, particularly with Democrats. With Republicans, there was more kind of uniform support. Although I have to say the far extremes of the Republican Party,
spoke about it.
Very scary. So I think this is to say that Israel is a beacon of hope in a dark world. It's not a perfect country. No country is.
We spoke about it the whole time.
But it's our country.
Yes.
And, my family, we have a small home in Jerusalem. It's a part of our lives. And we send so many young people and their parents and grandparents that Israel is such a place of possibility. The diaspora, we are in a two-way relationship. Yes. We have much to share. We have much to gain from the Jewish state. But this is a moment also, and I'll conclude saying, as we enter a new Jewish year, this is a time to remember we're Am Yisrael.
Yeah.
We have Medinat Yisrael, we're very proud of, but we are one Jewish people. Let's not, further demonize different people within our Jewish people so that we can stand together, so we can stand strong and we can strengthen Jewish life together. That to me is the most important message of this new year.
I agree. And first of all, Shana Tova. And I wanted to just add that you mentioned just to finish off, important for me to say that you mentioned the Democrats that support Israel. We had the Richie Torres congressman from the Bronx here. He's an African American. He's a gay person. He's phenomenal, and he understands that it has to stay bipartisan, and he understands also, which something that we in Israel should learn, that to criticize our own side. So when people on his side, even neighboring congressional districts, we had Mr. Bowman, who lost, thankfully, and AOC and Ilan Omar and all these other people that were very anti-Israel in a very not, I think, objective way. He was willing to take the political heat and go out and criticize his side. And I think in Israel, we should learn that also when our side does something that you mentioned, different discontent with the government policies on different issues, you shouldn't be, it's a war, we don't need to say. We need to fix our stuff and be willing to raise awareness to our own criticism on our side. So I think it's important to explain and put that into context. And yes, there are, like you said, both sides have their own anti-Israel bias that's very scary, and we need to, on both sides, confront it. So, Rabbi Jacobs.
Can I just, on that before you give the final Shana Tova, what's clear also is that people have demonized the entire Democratic Party because of the voices of a few. And I would just remind people, we meet with all of the Democratic senators every year, the Jewish communal leadership. There is overwhelming support for Israel. That's in the House, that's in the Senate. And so, to pick out a few voices and say, this is the Democratic Party. If we did that with the Republican Party, it would be unfair. So it's important for Israelis because they hear mostly about those few voices. You don't hear about all those voices.
You don't hear about Richie Torres all day in the media. You hear
don't.
about the other ones.
And the senators who,
Fetterman is very
in the quiet of every committee meeting who are there. So let's also tell the truth about what's happening. And that will, I think, give people more confidence. Not that we're going to relax. This is not a moment to relax. If you care.
But yes, we should be optimistic on the sense that most of Americans in the polls and most of American leadership from both parties pretty much is uniformly nuanced, obviously, on what is important, where they have criticism, etc. But they do, Baruch Hashem, like you say, we have support in America. Very different in Europe and in other places. But here, it's not just a Jewish issue, Israel. Like you said, it's an American issue. For the ideals, the objectives, and also the interests that America has in the area. So it's important what you just said, I think, very. So thank you so much, Rabbi Jacobs. It was a pleasure to talk to you. We learned a lot. Again, like we said before, you don't have to agree with everything each other. We do have to accept each other and try to work to something where Achdut doesn't mean achidut. Achdut means to disagree, but in a way that we know we're brothers and sisters. So it's important, and I appreciate that you're with us today.
It was great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi
Shana
Jacobs.
Tova.
Shana Tova.